you have been in a situation where you're scrolling through Instagram or scrolling through Facebook. Maybe you're watching TV or watching the movies. Or maybe you're just waiting for the ads to load on YouTube, or you're just sitting in the subway, okay? And you come across a visual. And this visual it could be a picture, it could be a video, but this visual is of a poor, impoverished young child that looks like it's probably from a developing country, looking at you straight in the eyes. How many times, or how many of you have come across a visual like that, right? See, almost all of us. And visuals like this, I have to admit, when I see visuals like this, they make me feel both sad, upset, and guilty, but also uncomfortable and bothered at the same time. Good evening, my name is Rafia Afsar and I'm a 23-year-old Indian who works in the international development sector. Despite my young age, I have been involved in this sector for close to a decade now, since I started leading community development projects in Bangladesh while I was in high school. And since then, I've worked in development in local contexts, national contexts, and international contexts. And to add on to that, I've had the privilege of living in 7 developing and developed countries, which truly shaped my perspective on the world. And this is important for you to know because it's been this perspective of mine that has shaped how I view development work, especially as someone, again, who has been in a developing context and also developed context. So, growing up, I came across a lot of content that would often portray the Global South in very stereotypical ways. And when I say the Global South, I'm referring to countries that were previously referred to as the Third World, but we stopped using that term in the 80s, and now we call them the Global South. And these are developing countries that fall in the southern hemisphere of the Earth, except for Australia and New Zealand. So this portrayal of the Global South, okay, there are many stereotypes that exist in this, but most importantly, we sometimes see the stereotype of the Global South as being poor, its people as being impoverished, or as them being oppressed and requiring and depending on our help. And this portrayal always bothered me, okay? But it truly started bothering me when this movie came out, Slumdog Millionaire. So despite the movie having won many Oscars and having been critically acclaimed, it also led to something else. It led to an increase in the stereotype of India, my home country, as being poor, as its people living in slums, and as there being a lot of poverty. Now, please don't get me wrong, I'm not denying that these problems don't exist in my country. They do, but for us to go ahead and use images like this to wash over an entire cultural identity, a historical identity, a political identity of a country, and paint it as just being poor is simply wrong. And since this has happened, since the movie came out, a lot of individuals that, once they find out that I'm from India, they ask me about the poverty in India or the slums in India, and it does leave me feeling quite uncomfortable. The most recent of these comments was from a colleague of mine who, in the past year, told me that they would never want their children to visit India because it's just so dirty, you know? So dirty. Now, I'm going to ask you a question. Is dirty an adjective that you would use to describe the New York subway? Yes? Yes. So the New York subway is dirty. Okay. And now New York is inside of the US. So based on the fact that the New York subway is dirty, can I jump to the conclusion that the US is dirty? No, right? That's too large of an assumption to make. And that's exactly what's happening over here. But still, I convinced myself that maybe this was just me simply over-examining and overthinking things like I normally do, especially as Slumdog Millionaire was the feel-good movie of the decade. And Indians seemed to be happy with it. It brought our stars up on the stage, and it also won several Oscars. But the more I kept on working in the development sector, the more people that I met, the more professionals that I met who wanted to go to Africa and work in the field, or the more events I attended, the more reports I read, I realized, no, this is a reality, and it's external to me, and we're just oblivious to it. So we're going to do a very quick activity, okay? I am going to say specific themes in international development, and as I say these themes, I want you to think about first visuals that pop up in your head. We're not going to share them, we're just going to keep them in your head, but it will help you get a better idea of this. Okay, so the first one is eradicating poverty. Okay, so just take a few moments to think about what comes in your head. Combating world hunger. Providing access to an education, And then there's having access to clean water, okay? And here they are, okay? These four. Now, I'm pretty sure, if not most of you, at least several of you must have gotten images of, for black and brown kids from developing countries in your head. And if you didn't, I'm glad that you didn't, but if you did, I don't want you to feel guilty or embarrassed. This is just the way many of us have been influenced to think about the world and these developmental problems. So, we collectively as a society have internalized this narrative, internalized this portrayal of developing countries as being poor, as problems only existing in that part of the world, not over here. And that's a problem. It's a problem because whenever we think about issues like poverty, or education, or health, or sanitation, we immediately think of poor countries. We don't think about what's happening here. And, sorry. Developed countries are only shown when they're either providing us with assistance, when they're providing us with aid, or when they're on the fields actually helping people. But why is this a problem, right? Now, I want you to know that this issue, there's so many different layers to it. You can really break it down and find so many themes across it. But today, I'm going to be focusing on providing you with two thoughts, two ideas that will help you at least have the foundation to begin this talk, to begin this conversation with others around you. Now, the first claim or the first idea is that given its historical roots, international development encourages the existence of a power imbalance and hierarchy between nations. Now, historically, development is something that a lot of Western imperial countries used to impose when they used to go on their conquest to find more lands or to extract resources. And when they used to do this, their agenda of development, I would say, used to focus on three main things. Okay, so the first one was promoting religion, so teaching people about God and our existence. Then there was the idea of science and knowledge, so teaching people about what is true, what is not true, what are facts. And then number three, teaching people how to live a civil life, how to live a proper life. And there's a poem written by a man called Rudyard Kipling, who also wrote The Jungle Book, and it's called The White Man's Burden. And he wrote this in 1899 at a time when the US was about to annex the Philippines. And this poem, I think, really nicely captures the whole idea of this narrative that used to exist with the Western imperial powers. So in the poem, Kipling is basically encouraging people in the US to enroll themselves in the army, to go to the Philippines, and to help, quote, the half-devil and half-child people living in the Philippines. And that is extremely disrespectful. And at the same time, he was also encouraging people to go and basically civilize the people, help them get rid of the famine, help them get rid of the diseases, right? So creating this dependency of people living in that part of the world to those people living in the western part of the world. Now, we're going to fast forward and come to the end of the war, okay? Colonization has happened, the wars have ended. Colonies are now starting to demand their independence, and the US has emerged as a global hegemonic power. It's 1949, and President Truman is giving his inaugural speech, which has famously been coined the 4-point program. Okay, and we are concerned with point number 4, and this is what he said. So in his address, President Truman basically says that the U.S. now, with the war having been finished, the U.S. must now use its knowledge, its scientific knowledge, its technical assistance, and provide that to individuals who are living in underdeveloped parts of the world. And in this, he justifies this by saying, well, more than half of the world currently lives in misery. They have poverty, and this poverty is a threat. It handicaps them. They don't have good economies. And on top of that, he also says that in order to help them realize the potential that their lives could have, we need to go and help them. We need to go and provide them with this assistance. And at the same time, the US should work with other countries who are also in this position to help them, again, achieve this. And also we should be working with the UN and its agencies, so ultimately we can have a world where we have peace, we have plenty, and we have freedom. Development has colonial roots, right? Because what we see is that in the pre-war period, we had the colonizers versus the ones that they were colonizing, and now after the war, we have the developed countries working with the countries that are developing, right? So, okay, and so we get that. There is this context of it being colonial and imperialistic. But we can't just stop promoting development now, can we? Because we have basic human rights. Every single person all around the world has the right to have a certain standard of living. So what do we do about that? Now, here's what I'm suggesting. Instead of, just either stopping development or continuing it in this manner, we need to first start with acknowledging the fact that yes, the manner in which we do development today is imperialistic. There is this hierarchy that exists between nations because there is this dependency that developed countries tend to go and help those who are developing. So what we need to start with doing in this situation is we need to first start with working with countries that are in the developing context. So maybe empower the local governments of those countries, look for grassroots leaders that are working in those developing countries and see in what capacity can we help them. Because if we continue this dependency where, okay, if I'm living in a developed country, I want to go and help that person living in that poor country, that's wrong. We need to start with seeing, okay, what is their government already doing? What might they need? How can my government possibly help them? Instead of maybe how can my government possibly pressure them into doing what they want. Now, the next claim is that international development continues to restrict its focus on the global south, again, the developing countries, which further encourages the assumption that these developmental issues only exist in that part of the region, right? Now, at the start of the 21st century, the UN came out with a set of goals, and these were the Millennium Development Goals, okay? These were 8 goals that primarily focused on issues of health, of education, and poverty, and these were primarily focused on developing countries, okay? And countries were meant to meet this by 2015, but they didn't, and then we had the Sustainable Development Goals. And the Sustainable Development Goals are goals that the UN is now working on meeting until 2030, and it's not just the UN, it's governments, it's the private sector, it's public sector, it's everyone. So when we compare these 2 goals side by side, right, what do we see? Well, firstly, obviously, we see that the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, there's more of them, and they also seem to be a little bit better designed, I think. But on a more serious note, the Sustainable Development Goals are more inclusive in 2 ways, okay? Firstly, they're more inclusive in terms of the themes that they address. So the SDGs, they go beyond just health and poverty and education, and they include ideas of the climate, right? So they have a lot of goals that focus on the climate, and they also bring in the aspect of the economy. So how can we maybe have more innovative practices, more innovative enterprises? How can we be more responsible consumers and producers? But a second aspect in which the SDGs are more inclusive is regarding who needs to work on them, right? So with the MDGs, as I mentioned earlier on, they were focused on developing countries. But with the SDGs, they're global goals. So they're goals that all of the countries at the UN have agreed that no, we all need to work on them collectively. This is not something that's restricted to one part of the world. These are problems that could exist here. They're problems that exist everywhere. So that's great, right? Because we see this transition that has happened at the policy level, at the leadership level, where countries are finally admitting that yes, it's not just poor countries who have this problem, we also have this problem. But we still continue to see a portrayal of developing countries in the same light. So a couple of weekends ago, I was at the Global Citizen Festival in New York City, okay? And for those of you who don't know, the Global Citizen Festival is a festival where actors, performers, musicians, they all come to perform, but at the same time, they also take time to speak about developmental issues. So while I was standing in the crowd with a couple of my friends, and I was listening to this speaker talk about SDG number 4, education, a part of me was happy with all of the progress that was being made, but the other part of me couldn't help but notice the fact that behind that speaker, they again continue to show us pictures of poor, black and brown kids from developing countries, and that infuriated me. So I asked my friends, who are these 2 German girls, that guys, is it just me, or do you notice this as well? And they did, and they were also uncomfortable with it. So at that point, really, why it bothered me was because at the festival, most of the attendees are young people, like the audience sitting in front of me. And if we continue to show our future policymakers, our future change makers, leaders, politicians, businesswomen and men, and if we show them this information, that this is the hierarchy that exists, that you need to go and help others living in other parts of the world, then that's going to influence the way that they carry out their work, and that's wrong. So, yeah, and what's going to happen is that when you talk about an issue such as poverty, if you're only showing images of people from developing parts of the world, you're going to forget about the fact that actually poverty is also a big issue here in the US, right? So, at this point, I'm not saying stop showing me poor people. No, there are definitely vulnerable groups that exist in the developing parts of the world. But in that situation, don't forget about vulnerable groups that live in other parts of the world. So this isn't so much about stop showing us them, it's more about show us everyone who has these developmental issues. Don't focus on developing parts, focus on the issues. So for example, if we're looking at gender, right? Don't think about, well, do also think about them, don't just think about women that are in South Asia that might not have access to a certain thing. Also keep in mind the fact that gender is also an issue in developed parts of the world, with transgenders not having as many rights, right? So you have to start thinking in that manner. You have to start thinking about, okay, if this is a developmental issue, where is it present? Learn about the context surrounding it, so the politics, the culture, the history, and how that has, led to the problem existing, and how can you address those different things to solve that problem. Because if we don't do that, right, if we don't reevaluate the ways in which that we think about developmental work and developmental problems in different parts of the world, then we're going to continue this narrative. We're going to continue this narrative where we convince ourselves that people living in a certain part of the world are waiting for us to come and help them, when in fact problems exist everywhere and everyone deserves to have those problems resolved. Right? And I think you guys, as the new generation, the speaker before me, they very nicely talked about the power that social media has and that technology has on shaping the way that you think. And I think that's also essential, because you guys, the future generations, you need to think about ways that you can maybe restructure this narrative, ways that you can bring in newer perspectives into this narrative so that you can really level the field. Because I really believe that if we ultimately want to meet the objective of international development, right? The objective of international development is for there to be developed countries, for all countries to ultimately have a point in history where we're all equal, we all have the same living standards. But if you truly want to reach that, we need to start with giving those countries the space to be that. Because if we continue to perpetuate this idea that, oh, there's this hierarchy, oh, the problem's only there, then we're not going to get anywhere. And we're going to grow up with another generation and more generations of people that are convinced that they're either saviors who need to go and help those who are in need, or that there are those in need who need saving. So I really want you, as you go home today, to really think about this and think about the ways in which that you yourself can maybe change how you perceive development. What can you do in the future to change the way that we talk about development? Because this is a really big problem and it still persists, and it really stops us from ultimately reaching our goal, which is to have developed nations. Thank you so much.